The storm hit harder than he expected. The truck engine coughed once, then died, leaving only the sound of wind tearing through the mountain pass. Ethan Walker sat still, gripping the frozen steering wheel as if he could will it back to life. The fuel gauge was flat on empty. The heater had given up an hour ago. Every breath he took came out in a white ghost of regret. In the passenger seat, Ranger, a black and tan shepherd with eyes too knowing for a dog, watched him quietly, head tilted, waiting for a decision that wasn't coming. "That's it, bud," Ethan muttered. End of the road. Snow drifted through the cracked windshield. The world outside was nothing but white silence. His phone had no signal. His bank account, frozen, his past, erased. He closed his eyes. For the first time in months, there was no plan, no place to go. Only a man, a dog, and a mountain that didn't care if they lived or died. And somewhere deep inside that silence, something in Ranger moved first. The dog pawed at the door, ears pricked, a low whine rising in his throat. Ethan opened his eyes. "You want out there? In that?" Ranger barked once, short, certain. Ethan laughed under his breath, a sound half broken. "Fine, you win." He shoved the door open and stumbled into the snow. The wind cut his face like glass. Ranger jumped out beside him, nose to the ground, already searching. They had to move. The truck was done. If they stayed, they'd freeze before morning. Ethan slung his old duffel over one shoulder, everything he owned inside: a tarp, a rusted shovel, 2 cans of beans, and a photograph he could no longer look at without shaking. They trudged forward through knee-deep drifts until the truck disappeared behind them. For miles, nothing but the sound of their breathing. Ethan used to design skyscrapers. He'd stood in boardrooms with men in tailored suits, arguing over blueprints that touched the clouds. Now he was counting his steps, following a dog through the wilderness like a man following faith. By afternoon, the storm eased. The sky turned the color of bruised steel. That was when Ranger stopped. His nose pressed into the snow, tail stiff. He barked once, then trotted toward a shadow at the base of the ridge. "What is it?" Ethan called, but followed anyway. Half buried under snow was the outline of a building, a cabin, maybe decades old, its roof half collapsed, walls leaning like tired bones. A metal sign hung from one nail, swaying in the wind. Camp Providence, 1943. Ethan ran his hand over the letters. "Guess this is home, Ranger?" Inside smelled of rust, oil, and something older, like time itself. He cleared a spot on the floor, gathered fallen boards, and struck his lighter. The flame flickered once, twice, then caught. Smoke curled towards the rafters. Ranger circled close, lying near the warmth. His breathing filled the small space, steady and real. Ethan watched the fire dance and felt a strange ache in his chest. Not pain exactly, but the weight of remembering he was still alive. He split a can of beans between them. Ranger got the larger half. "You earned it," Ethan said. The wind howled outside, clawing at the thin walls. Ethan leaned back, closing his eyes. For a brief second he imagined the voices of his wife and son, distant, gentle, gone. Then Ranger's growl shattered the moment, deep, low, protective. Ethan sat up fast. "What is it?" The dog was on his feet, facing the doorway, every muscle tight. A faint crunch came from the snow outside. Footsteps. "Hey!" Ethan shouted. "Who's out there?" Silence. Then a small voice. "Please, I'm not here to steal." A figure stumbled through the doorway, a teenage boy, soaked and shivering, clutching a torn backpack. He looked barely 16. Ranger tensed but didn't move. Ethan lowered his shovel. "Close the door," Ethan said. "You're letting the heat out." The boy obeyed, collapsing near the fire. "Name's Lucas." he whispered. Been running for days. Running from what? Lucas stared into the flames, eyes hollow. Doesn't matter. Just needed somewhere they wouldn't find me. Ethan looked at Ranger, who had already relaxed, tail thumping once on the floor. The dog had decided the boy could stay. That was enough. All right, Ethan said quietly. Then you're safe here, for now. Outside, snow began to fall again, erasing every footprint that led to the cabin. Inside, the fire burned steady, and for the first time in months, Ethan realized the silence didn't hurt anymore. It felt like the beginning of something. A man, a boy, a dog, and a mountain that still had secrets left to tell. The morning came brittle and sharp, the kind of cold that bit through bone. The fire in the cabin had burned out hours ago, leaving only a curl of smoke and the faint smell of ash. Ethan woke to the sound of Ranger pacing near the door, nails scraping the wooden floor. The dog's breath clouded the air with every exhale. "You're up early," Ethan murmured, rubbing warmth back into his hands. Ranger stopped pacing and looked at him, head cocked, eyes steady, as if to say, "We can't stay here forever." Outside, the storm had calmed, but the silence was heavier than before. The snow had swallowed the truck completely. Whatever fuel might have been left was gone, buried under a white grave. Ethan stepped outside, his boots crunching into the snow's crust. The air was thin and tasted like metal. Ranger trotted ahead, his paws light, his body alert. The mountain stretched endless in every direction, just trees, rock, and silence. He scanned the horizon, thinking of the nearest town. Maybe 30 miles, maybe more. His legs were shaking from hunger. "We'll freeze before we get halfway," he muttered. Ranger stopped and looked back, tail low, waiting. "Yeah." Ethan sighed. "Guess we're staying." He scavenged what he could. Broken. Lumber. An old tarp from the truck. A few nails rusted into shape. Ranger dragged a branch in his jaws, dropping it proudly beside the pile. Together, they built a crude shelter leaning against the old cabin wall, a patchwork of wood, tarp, and hope. By dusk, the wind began again. Not a storm, but enough to remind them who ruled this mountain. Ethan huddled beneath the tarp, wrapped in his jacket, Ranger curled tight beside him. "Used to be I'd complain if the heater in my truck broke," Ethan said softly. "Now look at us." Ranger's tail brushed against his leg, a quiet reminder that he wasn't talking to himself. That night, hunger came creeping back. Ethan split their last can of beans. Ranger ate his share, then nudged the remaining bit toward Ethan's hand with his nose. Ethan smiled weakly. "Don't do that, pal. You need it more than me." But Ranger just stared, unblinking, waiting until Ethan took a bite. Hours passed. The mountain seemed to hold its breath. Then, sometime past midnight, Ranger's ears twitched. He stood suddenly, head high, nostrils flaring. "What is it?" Ethan whispered. The dog growled low, not out of fear but instinct. Then he darted from under the tarp, disappearing into the dark. "Ranger!" Ethan scrambled after him, his flashlight barely cutting through the snow. The beam caught glimpses of fur, paw prints, and then nothing. Panic clawed up his throat. He shouted until his voice cracked. The mountain swallowed every sound. Then, faintly, a bark, short, urgent. Ethan followed it, slipping on the ice, pushing through thorny brush until he stumbled into a narrow crevice in the rock. Inside, Ranger's shape flickered in the light. He was pawing at something. A hole, a hollow. Ethan crouched low. The air seeping from the opening was warmer than outside. "You found a cave," he breathed. Ranger barked again, tail wagging once. Inside the cave, the floor dipped into smooth stone. Water glistened in a small pool. Fresh, clean, alive. Ethan knelt and drank with shaking hands. It was the first real water he'd had in days. Ranger lapped beside him, ears flicking at the echoes. When Ethan finally sat back, dripping and trembling, he looked at the dog. "You just saved us, you know that?" Ranger blinked, as if he didn't need the acknowledgement. For him, it was never about saving. It was about surviving together. They explored the cave deeper. There were marks on the walls, carved symbols half faded by time. Old mining gear lay rusted near the entrance, and a lantern still hanging from a nail, its glass cracked but intact. Ethan lit it. The flame filled the cave with a soft, golden hue. He realized something then. This wasn't just luck. Ranger had led him here for a reason. His instincts, sharper than any map or plan, had pulled them toward life. By dawn, Ethan had dragged supplies inside. The tarp, the cans, the tools. The cave would be safer than the cabin. Warmer, quieter, hidden from whatever else might roam these woods. As the light of morning spilled across the stone walls, Ethan set his hand on Ranger's back. "Maybe this isn't the end, huh?" Ranger looked up, his ears flicking at the sound of wind outside, then pressed his head against Ethan's knee. That simple gesture, weight, warmth, and wordless trust, hit harder than anything else. Ethan felt something shift inside him. He wasn't just running from the world anymore. He was starting to build something in its ashes. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the snow in pink and gold, Ethan stood outside the cave, watching Ranger chase his own breath in circles, barking once at the dying light. Ethan smiled. "We'll make it, boy, one day at a time." The mountain was still merciless, the cold still bit deep. But now there was firelight, running water, and a heartbeat beside his own. And for the first time since his life had fallen apart, Ethan didn't feel like a ghost haunting his own story. He felt human again, because Ranger had reminded him how. The days began to blend together, marked only by sunrise and the sound of Ranger's paws crunching over frozen earth. The cave had become their shelter, but Ethan knew it wouldn't last. The wind cut through the entrance like a blade, and when storms rolled in, the cold pressed against his bones until sleep was impossible. He needed walls, real ones, something solid enough to outlast the mountain. He walked the perimeter each morning, studying the terrain. Years of designing buildings in the city had trained his mind to see structure where others saw chaos. Here, surrounded by rock and ruin, he saw potential. "Guess it's time to build again," he said, voice rough from silence. Ranger tilted his head, tail wagging once like he understood. Ethan began scavenging. He found a pile of old mining scrap near a frozen creek, rusted steel beams, broken planks, and sheets of corrugated metal weathered by decades of snow. He worked from sunrise until his hands split open. Ranger stayed close, dragging branches, nosing through debris, barking when something moved in the trees. By the third day they had the frame of a wall. Ethan packed mud and rock between the gaps, tightening each joint until it stood against the wind. Ranger watched, panting, eyes bright with the kind of loyalty that didn't ask for reward. "Not bad for a couple of strays," Ethan said, leaning against the new wall. He could almost imagine a roof again, a fire that didn't choke on smoke, maybe even a door that closed. That night, the wind screamed through the valley. The new wall held. Ethan and Ranger lay beside the small fire inside the cave, exhaustion sinking into them both. Ranger shifted closer, his warmth pressing into Ethan's ribs. The rhythmic sound of the dog's breathing lulled him into sleep. But the mountain didn't rest. Sometime before dawn, Ranger woke first. He stood, ears sharp, muscles stiff. Low growl rumbled in his chest. Ethan stirred instantly. "What is it?" Ranger moved to the cave mouth, tail straight, nose flaring. Ethan grabbed the shovel by instinct, stepping into the cold air. At first he saw nothing, only trees swaying under the pale moon. Then a flicker of movement caught his eye. A figure, distant, darting between trunks, too small for a bear, too fast for a deer. "Hey!" Ethan shouted, but the figure vanished. Ranger barked once, then twice, then went silent. The forest answered with nothing. By morning, the tracks were half buried in snow. Human, boot prints. Ethan's jaw tightened. "We're not alone out here." Ranger sniffed the trail but didn't chase. Instead, he looked back, waiting for Ethan's cue. The message was clear. Observe, don't engage. They returned to work. The next few days, Ethan built faster. The cold didn't matter. The exhaustion didn't matter. He needed structure. He needed purpose. With every board he nailed, he felt less like a ghost and more like a man reclaiming something that had been stolen. Ranger adapted too. He wasn't just company anymore, he was a partner. When Ethan hauled wood from the creek, Ranger dragged small branches with his jaws. When predators came near, he barked once, deep and sharp, enough to send them running. At night, he'd curl against Ethan's side, his heartbeat steady against the storm's howl. On the 6th day, while clearing rubble behind the cabin ruins, Ethan's shovel hit something solid. Metal, not rock. He brushed away the dirt, revealing a rectangular plaque, tarnished but still legible. Camp Providence, 1943. Property of the U.S. Army Corps. Ethan stared at the words. What the hell were they doing up here? He lifted the plaque, feeling the cold weight in his hands. The name tugged at something deep in his memory, a story his grandfather once told about secret military shelters hidden in the Rockies during the war. Places built for survival when the world seemed ready to burn. He looked around. The collapsed building, the mining scrap, the tunnel entrances half buried in snow. It all made sense now. This wasn't just an abandoned camp. It had history. Ranger sniffed the plaque, sneezed, then barked once, sharp and eager, as if sensing the shift in Ethan's mind. "Yeah, boy," Ethan said quietly. "Looks like we're rebuilding something bigger than us." That evening, Ethan couldn't sleep. He kept turning the plaque in his hands, tracing the letters. The idea that others had once fought to survive here gave him a strange kind of comfort. He wasn't the first man to be broken and left in the mountains to find meaning again. But when the firelight flickered across the cave walls, something else caught his eye. A faint mark carved into the stone. Numbers, coordinates. He leaned closer. The engraving was old but clear. N38 to W106 to... Ranger lifted his head, watching him. Ethan whispered, "It's a map." He copied the numbers onto a scrap of paper torn from his notebook. Whatever was hidden up here had been meant to stay buried. But the mountain had decided to show its hand, and Ranger, as always, had led him right to it. The next morning, he packed supplies into his duffel. "Come on, partner," he said. "Let's see what's waiting out there." Ranger barked once, tail high, and bounded into the snow ahead. Behind them, the first wall of their new life stood against the wind, stubborn, imperfect, unbreakable. A start, carved from nothing but instinct and will. Ethan looked back only once before disappearing into the trees. The fire still smouldered inside the cave, its smoke curling into the pale sky like a promise that someone, finally, was alive again. The sun barely touched the ridge that morning when Ethan and Ranger returned from scouting. Frost clung to the pines like white ash, and every breath turned into steam. The wall they had built still stood, stoic against the cold. For the first time, the place didn't look like a ruin. It looked like the beginning of a home, but the plaque from the day before wouldn't leave Ethan's mind. Camp Providence, 1943. Those carved coordinates. They haunted him in the quiet. Every time the wind moved through the trees, he imagined whispers of soldiers who once stood where he stood now, waiting out a different kind of war. He spent the morning clearing snow near the back of the old foundation. Ranger stayed close, tail swaying lazily but eyes always alert. The dog had changed. Sharper, more aware. He was no longer just following Ethan. He was leading when needed, choosing paths through the forest that Ethan had stopped questioning. By noon, Ethan's shovel hit something solid under the frozen earth. It wasn't stone. The sound was hollow. He knelt, brushing snow aside until his fingers touched metal. A box, rusted, dented, but intact. He pried it open with the edge of his knife. Inside were scraps of paper, a small notebook wrapped in oilcloth, and a folded map so fragile it crackled when he touched it. Ranger moved closer, sniffing the tin box, then sat down beside him like a silent witness. Ethan opened the notebook carefully. The handwriting was cramped, fading with age. It wasn't military code, just the words of a man trying to survive. The entries were dated from the winter of 1944. The soldier wrote about isolation, about waiting for orders that never came, about the mountain swallowing entire patrols. One line stopped Ethan cold. They said the mountain listens, but it never speaks. It only keeps. He flipped to the last page. In faded ink, barely legible, the soldier had written, "The mountain keeps its secrets." Ethan stared at the words until the letters blurred. His hands trembled, not from the cold, but from memory. His father had been a soldier too, a quiet man who'd come home from Vietnam with the same 1,000-yard stare. He used to sit by the fire, polishing, his boots saying nothing for hours. Once, when Ethan was 10, he'd told him, "Survival isn't about strength, son. It's about remembering who you were before the fear started." Ethan hadn't thought about that in years, but now, standing in the snow, holding a stranger's journal that echoed his father's silence, he understood. Maybe survival wasn't just about staying alive. Maybe it was about rebuilding what the world had taken. He spread the old map across the ground. It showed the mountain as it once was, roads, tunnels, a network of hidden shelters. One mark, drawn in red pencil, circled an area labeled Sector D, Supply Cache. The same coordinates carved into the cave wall. "Ranger," he whispered. "We're standing on something bigger than a ruin." Ranger barked once, tail sweeping the snow. Ethan folded the map, tucking it inside his jacket. "Come on, partner. Let's see what else this mountain's hiding." They spent the rest of the day tracing paths through the woods, following faint outlines of old trails. The snow made every sound louder, the crunch of boots, the snap of twigs, the steady rhythm of Ranger's paws. The air smelled of pine and iron. By late afternoon, the clouds thickened again. A storm was coming. They turned back toward the cabin. Halfway there, Ranger froze. His ears twitched, his body rigid. Ethan followed his gaze. Near the tree line, something dark shifted, too deliberate to be the wind. Ranger growled, low and steady. Ethan crouched, whispering, "What do you see?" A flicker of movement, then nothing. But when they reached the cabin, the truth waited in the snow. Boot prints, fresh ones, circling the camp. Ethan's stomach knotted. He knelt to study them. Not his, not Lucas's. Too heavy for one person. 2 sets, maybe 3. They led toward the ridge, then vanished into the trees. He turned to Ranger. The dog's fur bristled, nose pressed to the ground. He gave a short, angry bark that echoed off the rocks. "Easy," Ethan said softly, though his own pulse was racing. If someone wanted to attack, they'd have done it. But that wasn't true, and both of them knew it. Whoever was out there had been close enough to watch them work, close enough to know they weren't alone anymore. That night, Ethan couldn't rest. The fire crackled low. The wind whispered through the half-built walls, and every creak sounded like a footstep. Ranger stayed awake too, lying near the door, ears flicking at every sound. Ethan opened the soldier's notebook again, flipping through the entries until he found one dated near the end. They said we weren't alone on this mountain. Something moves at night. Not the wind. Not animals. We stopped asking what. He closed it, feeling the chill crawl up his spine. Maybe the soldier had gone mad. Or maybe he'd written the truth. By dawn, Ethan had made a decision. If someone or something was watching, he needed to know who. He checked his tools, loaded a makeshift spear he'd fashioned from rebar, and nodded to Ranger. "Let's find out what kind of ghosts this mountain keeps." Ranger barked once, sharp, ready. They stepped into the rising light, footprints marking a new trail in the snow. Behind them, the fire still glowed faintly inside the cave, flickering against the old words carved into the wall, reminders that the mountain remembered everything. And for the first time, Ethan wasn't afraid of what he might find. He was afraid of what the mountain might reveal. The light on the mountain faded early that evening. The last streaks of orange slipped behind the ridge, leaving the forest in a dim, restless blue. Ethan was stacking firewood near the wall when Ranger froze mid-step. The dog's head snapped toward the tree line, ears high, tail stiff. "What is it, boy?" Ethan whispered. Ranger gave a low growl, quiet but certain. Something was out there. Ethan reached for the shovel leaning against the wall and waited. The air grew heavy, the kind of silence that made every heartbeat sound too loud. Then he saw it. A figure, small, thin, moving awkwardly through the snow. Not an animal, a person. "Hey!" Ethan called out, his voice echoing through the cold. The figure stopped, half hidden behind a pine. For a second there was no sound except the wind. Then a voice answered, shaky and young. Don't come closer." The boy stepped into the fading light, maybe 15 or 16, wearing a torn hoodie and shoes too thin for the snow. His cheeks were red from the cold, his hands trembling. But one hand clutched something metallic. A knife. Ethan lifted his palms slowly. "Easy, kid. I'm not gonna hurt you." Ranger moved between them, muscles tight but calm. He didn't growl this time, just stood still, watching both of them, measuring the space like he was keeping the mountain's peace. The boy's eyes darted to Ranger. "Is he gonna bite me?" "Only if I tell him to," Ethan said. "And I won't, unless you give me a reason." The boy hesitated, then lowered the knife an inch. I needed somewhere to sleep. I'll leave in the morning." Ethan nodded toward the half-built shelter. "You'll freeze before that. Come inside." The boy shook his head. "I don't need your help." Ranger took a slow step forward, tail moving once, not threatening, just present. The boy stared at the dog for a long moment, then his shoulders sagged. The knife slipped from his hand and landed in the snow with a soft thud. Ethan picked it up, handed it back. "Keep it. You might need it for wolves." The boy frowned, not sure if it was a joke or not. "You're not scared I'll use it on you?" Ethan shrugged. "If you were gonna, you already would have." Inside the cave, the fire flickered low. Ethan handed him a tin of soup and a blanket that smelled faintly of smoke. The boy ate in silence, every spoonful, cautious, as if the food might vanish. When he finally spoke, his voice was small. "Name's Lucas." "Ethan," he replied, "and this is Ranger." Lucas glanced at the dog. "He's not like most dogs." "No?" Ethan said quietly. "He's not." They didn't talk much after that. The storm outside began to build again, whispering against the stone. Ethan added wood to the fire, the crackle filling the space between them. Ranger lay near the entrance, watching the flames, his ears twitching every time the wind changed direction. After a while, Ethan noticed Lucas's hands. The scars across his knuckles weren't from work. They were from fights. He'd seen them before, on men who'd been cornered by life too early. "You running from something?" Ethan asked. Lucas didn't look up. "From somewhere." Ethan waited, but that was all the boy offered. When Lucas finally fell asleep, curled near the fire like a stray cat, Ethan sat awake, staring into the flames. Ranger shifted closer, resting his chin on Ethan's boot. "Yeah, I know," Ethan murmured. "We don't need more trouble." Ranger didn't move. His amber eyes stayed on the boy, alert even in half-sleep. The next morning, Lucas was still there. He'd cleaned the dishes without being asked, and was trying, unsuccessfully, to split firewood. Ethan watched from a distance before walking over. "You're holding the axe wrong," he said. Lucas frowned. "I'm doing fine." Ethan took the handle, adjusted his grip. "You're wasting strength. Let the weight do the work." He demonstrated, the axe slicing through the log clean. Lucas tried again. The second swing split the wood perfectly. He smiled, a small, surprised thing, but real. "Not bad," Ethan said. "You learn fast." That afternoon, Lucas helped patch the gaps in the wall while Ranger fetched branches, wagging his tail each time Lucas laughed. The sound startled Ethan the first time he heard it. It had been months since laughter filled this place. By evening, the three of them sat by the fire. The storm had passed, leaving a still, golden calm. Lucas stared into the flames and said quietly, "They called me a lost cause, said I couldn't be fixed." Ethan poked the fire with a stick. "They said that about me, too." Lucas looked at him. "You believe it?" Ethan met his eyes. "I used to." Ranger yawned, laying his head across Lucas's knee. The boy froze, then smiled faintly and began to stroke the dog's fur. For a long time, nobody spoke. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the slow, steady breathing of a dog who trusted too easily for the world he lived in. When the stars came out, Ethan stepped outside. The mountain was silent again, wrapped in moonlight. He looked back at the cave, the warm glow spilling from inside, the silhouettes of a boy and a dog. For the first time in years, he realized he wasn't just surviving. He was living. He whispered into the night, more to himself than anyone else. "Guess the mountain's not done teaching me things." Behind him, Ranger lifted his head and barked once, soft and sure, as if agreeing that maybe, just maybe, their little world was beginning to heal. The first sign of trouble came with the sound. A low, hollow roar that rolled across the valley like distant thunder. Ethan stepped outside, the sky bruised and heavy above him. The wind carried a sharp bite, scattering snow that hadn't yet fallen. "Storm's coming," he muttered. Lucas joined him at the doorway, squinting towards the ridge. "How bad?" Ethan glanced at the horizon. The clouds were moving too fast, dragging a wall of white with them. "Bad enough." Ranger barked once, pacing in tight circles, tail low, restless. He knew before either of them did. The mountain was about to turn cruel again. They worked quickly, reinforcing the roof, covering the walls with tarp, tying ropes between trees so they wouldn't lose their way if the blizzard hit full force. But nothing could prepare them for what came next. By dusk, the world disappeared. The storm roared down the mountain like a living thing. The wind howled through every crack, snow forced its way into their shelter, and the cold cut deep enough to make breathing hurt. Ethan shouted over the storm, "Keep the fire going." Lucas fed wood into the flames, hands shaking. Ranger stood at the entrance, barking into the blinding white, his body trembling but unmoving, a sentinel against the dark. Then the roof gave way. It happened in a single, violent moment. The wood cracked, snow poured in, and Ethan was thrown backward. The fire sputtered, sparks dying in the sudden flood of ice and wind. "Ethan!" Lucas screamed, trying to dig him out. The roof beam had collapsed across Ethan's leg. He gritted his teeth, breath ragged, face pale. "I'm fine," he lied. Ranger lunged forward, digging with his paws, teeth gripping the edge of the tarp to pull it free. Lucas joined in, his fingers raw and bleeding, until they dragged Ethan clear. But outside, the storm only grew worse. The fire was gone. The cold was merciless. "Lucas," Ethan gasped, "we need help." "There's no one out here," the boy cried. Ethan looked toward Ranger, the dog's ears twitched, eyes burning in the dark. "Go," Ethan said hoarsely. "Find someone." Ranger hesitated for a heartbeat, whined low, then bolted into the storm. His dark form vanished into the white. For hours, Lucas stayed beside Ethan, holding his hand, trying to keep him conscious. "You can't sleep, you hear me? You'll freeze." Ethan's eyes fluttered. "You should have left me." "Shut up," Lucas said fiercely. "You're all I've got." Outside, the storm devoured everything. Trees cracked under the weight of snow. The wind screamed through the canyon. But somewhere in that chaos, a dog ran. Silent, relentless, guided by instinct older than fear. Ranger's paws bled from ice. His fur was coated with frost. He moved by scent, not sight, following faint traces of smoke and wood. Miles down the slope he found it, a flicker of light through the white. A cabin, half buried but alive. Inside, a fire burned, and beside it sat an old man with a rifle across his knees. When Ranger burst through the door, the man nearly fell out of his chair. "What the hell?" Ranger barked once, twice, then turned toward the door again, glancing back. The old man blinked, then nodded slowly. "You want me to follow, don't you?" He grabbed his coat, lantern, and rope. "All right, old boy. Lead the way." They fought their way through the storm for nearly an hour. Boone, because that was his name, was a retired ranger who had chosen solitude over the noise of the world. He'd never seen a dog move with such purpose. When they reached the broken shelter, the wind was dying, but the cold was still lethal. Boone knelt beside Ethan, checking his pulse. "He's alive," he said. "Barely." Together, they dragged Ethan inside the old man's cabin, wrapped him in blankets, and fed the fire until it roared back to life. Lucas sat by his side, holding Ranger close, both of them shivering but refusing to sleep. Boone poured a bit of whiskey into Ethan's mouth, the sharp smell filling the room. "You're lucky," he muttered. "Most men wouldn't last an hour up there." Ethan stirred, voice cracked. "Didn't do it alone." Boone looked at Ranger, then back at Ethan. "No, you didn't." The night stretched long. The wind moaned outside like the ghosts of the mountain, but inside, the fire held strong. Boone patched Ethan's leg as best he could, using an old splint and torn cloth. Lucas whispered, "Will he make it?" Boone didn't answer right away. Then quietly, "He's tougher than he looks." Ranger didn't leave Ethan's side once. When Ethan drifted in and out of sleep, he could feel the dog's body pressed against him, a heartbeat in the dark. By morning, the storm had passed. The sun rose weakly through the broken clouds, lighting up a world buried under white. Ethan woke to the crackle of firewood and the smell of coffee. Boone sat by the hearth, cleaning his rifle. Lucas was feeding Ranger scraps of bread. "You're up," Boone said. "Good. We need to talk." Ethan tried to sit, grimacing at the pain in his leg. "About what?" Boone looked out the window towards the ruins on the ridge. "That place you were rebuilding. You really think you can make something up there?" Ethan followed his gaze. The cabin was gone, buried in snow, but somehow he didn't feel defeated. "I don't just think it," he said softly. "I have to." Boone studied him for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "Then you're crazier than I thought. Maybe that's what it takes." Ranger wagged his tail, looking between them. Ethan reached down, resting a hand on the dog's neck. "We'll rebuild, partner, all of us this time." Outside, the mountain glistened under new light. The storm had taken everything again, yet somehow what remained felt stronger. For the first time, Ethan didn't see ruins, he saw foundations. And beside him, a boy, a dog, and an old man who hadn't spoken to anyone in years. 3 souls the world had forgotten, looked out at the same endless white and began to believe in something bigger than survival. Spring came late to the mountain that year. Snow melted in slow trickles, carving veins of silver through the rocks. The forest smelled of pine and thawing earth. For the first time in months, the world didn't feel like it wanted to kill them. Ethan stood on the ridge, his crutch sinking into the damp soil. His legs still hurt, but the pain no longer owned him. Below, the old foundation was gone, buried under snow and wreckage, but in its place, a plan was forming. Boone approached, carrying a bundle of lumber on his shoulder. "You sure about this?" he asked. Ethan looked at the clearing. "If the mountain took it once, we'll make it give something back." Lucas grinned. "You mean rebuild?" Ethan nodded. "No, reborn." They worked for days, cutting, hauling, stacking. Boone's old cabin became their base. Lucas, light and fast, climbed trees to rig ropes and pulleys. Ethan taught him how to measure walls and reinforce beams, using scraps of steel from the abandoned mine. Ranger hauled branches, dragged tarps, even helped pull ropes with a harness made from torn fabric. The dog worked without complaint, as if he knew this wasn't just another shelter, it was their home. At night, they sat around the fire. Boone told stories from before the world got mean. Lucas asked questions about everything. Ethan listened more than he spoke. One evening, while Ethan traced lines in the dirt, Lucas leaned over. "What's that?" "Layout," Ethan said. 3 small cabins connected by a common room. Enough for more than just us." "More?" Lucas frowned. "Who else?" Ethan stared at the fire. "People who need it." Boone chuckled. "You're building a village for ghosts." "Not ghosts," Ethan said quietly. "The ones who made it out." Word spread faster than they expected. It started with a wanderer, an old veteran named Reggie who stumbled through the woods one morning, half-starved and half-frozen. Ranger found him first, leading him by the sleeve back to camp. After that came a woman with a cracked voice and a guitar on her back. Then a father and daughter who'd been living out of a car. No one knew how they heard about the place. Maybe through whispers, maybe through faith. But one by one, they came. Ethan never turned anyone away. Ranger greeted each newcomer like family. He'd run down the trail whenever someone approached, bark once, then lead them to the fire. He seemed to know who was broken and who was dangerous, and he was never wrong. Soon the clearing was alive again, hammering, laughter, the smell of soup over fire. Lucas built a swing between 2 pines for the little girl. Boone fixed the stove with parts scavenged from a snowplow. Ethan oversaw it all, his eyes always on the ridge, as if expecting the mountain itself to rise and test them again. One night, Reggie came to him. "You know what they're calling this place?" Ethan looked up from the fire. "No." "Mountain Haven." Ethan blinked. "That what you call it?" Reggie grinned. "Not me, the kid. Lucas. Said it felt like heaven, but grounded." Lucas, sitting nearby, blushed. It just sounded right. Ethan smiled. "Then it's right." The next morning, he carved the name into a plank of wood and nailed it above the entrance. The letters weren't perfect, but they stood proud against the rising sun. Mountain Haven. Life settled into rhythm. Boone took charge of supplies. Lucas taught the newcomers how to gather firewood and purify water. Ethan built fences, fixed leaks, and patched roofs. And Ranger was everywhere. He'd check on the sick, curling up beside them through feverish nights. He'd run ahead on trails to scout for food or danger. When someone cried, he'd nudge their hands until they smiled. His fur carried the scent of smoke, pine, and survival, a symbol of the mountain itself. Scarred, stubborn, alive. But peace never lasts long on the mountain. One afternoon, while Ethan was working near the stream, he noticed footprints leading downriver. Boot prints, heavy, too straight for hikers. He followed them quietly, Ranger at his side. The tracks led to a burnt-out vehicle half hidden in the brush. Inside were old military crates, stamped with government seals, supplies, maps, ammunition. Ranger sniffed one of the boxes, growled low. Ethan lifted the lid and froze. Inside were sealed envelopes, yellowed with age, each marked Camp Providence. He stared, heart pounding. They knew about this place, he whispered. All along. That night, as the camp gathered for dinner, Ethan said nothing. He watched Ranger lying by the fire, tail flicking lazily, eyes half closed, but always listening. Boone noticed. Something on your mind? Ethan nodded toward the horizon. The past doesn't like being buried. Boone poured him coffee. Then we'll build stronger. Ethan took a sip, his gaze drifting towards the stars. This place saved us, Boone. Maybe it's meant to save others, too. The old man smiled. Then we keep the fire lit. And they did. That night, snow began to fall again, but gently this time. Not the angry kind that kills, but the kind that softens everything it touches. The cabins glowed under the moonlight, smoke curling from chimneys, laughter echoing against the trees. Ethan lay awake, listening to the rhythm of the mountain, the crackle of wood, the breathing of his people, and Ranger's soft snore by the doorway. For the first time since losing everything, he didn't dream of the world he'd left behind. He dreamed of the one they were building. Mountain Haven wasn't just a refuge anymore. It was proof that even in the coldest places, warmth could return. One wall, one fire, one heartbeat at a time. Summer came slow to the mountains. The snow melted, the streams sang again, and for a few precious weeks, Mountain Haven felt like paradise. People laughed while hauling lumber, kids chased Ranger through the clearing, and Ethan thought, maybe, just maybe, they'd made it. Then the first letter arrived. It came folded in an official envelope, sealed with a logo Ethan hadn't seen in years. State Department of Land and Resource Management. Boone handed it to him with a frown. You might want to read this sitting down. Ethan opened it by the firelight. The words hit like a punch. Unauthorized habitation on restricted property. Eviction pending. Vacate within 30 days. He read it twice before the meaning sank in. Haven wasn't just on forgotten land. It sat on an old mining claim still registered to a private company. Lucas was the first to speak. They can't take it. We built this. Boone leaned back, weary. Doesn't matter who built it. Matters who owns the paper. Ethan folded the letter, staring into the flames. Someone owns this mountain, and now they've noticed us. The next week, a convoy came. 3 black SUVs crawled up the dirt road like beetles, tires cracking over roots. A man in a suit stepped out of place among the pine and ash. He was tall, polished, his smile sharp as glass. Ethan Walker? He asked. Ethan nodded. Calvin Hart. I represent Apex Development Group. We recently acquired the mining rights to this property. Congratulations. You're living on what's about to become a luxury resort. Ethan's jaw tightened. This land was dead when we found it. We brought it back. Hart laughed softly. That's sweet. But this isn't about morality. It's about money. He glanced around at the cabins, the people watching from doorways. You'll get a relocation grant, enough to find somewhere less valuable. Boone muttered, He means somewhere invisible. Hart smiled again. I'll give you 30 days. After that, my crew starts clearing the site. As the SUVs rolled away, the camp fell silent. Ethan stood still for a long time, the paper still in his hand. Lucas broke the silence. We can fight this, right? Ethan didn't answer. Ranger barked once, low and uncertain, as if sensing something heavy settling over the mountain. That night, no one slept. The air was thick, charged. Ethan sat by the fire, turning the letter over and over. Boone finally spoke. If we stand against them, we'll lose everything. But if we leave, we lose who we are. Ethan looked at Ranger, lying beside Lucas. The dog's tail twitched in uneasy sleep. We've built something worth fighting for, he said. Over the next few days, they reinforced the cabins, stored food, and mapped escape routes, just in case. Ethan sent Boone to town for legal advice, but the verdict came back grim. Apex owned every inch of the land, and Hart had the law on his side. Then came the traps. It started with a scream. Lucas had gone to check the waterline. Ranger ran after him, barking wildly. Then a sharp snap cut through the air, followed by another bark. Painful, desperate. Ethan dropped his tools and sprinted down the trail. He found Lucas kneeling in the mud, his hands shaking. It was a trap. He tried to stop me from stepping in. Ranger lay nearby, his paw caught in a steel snare buried under leaves. Blood stained the snowmelt. Ethan fell to his knees. Easy, boy, easy. His voice broke. Boone appeared moments later, cutting the wire with a hatchet. Ranger whimpered but didn't fight. His eyes locked on Ethan's, trusting, loyal even through agony. Lucas was crying. They did this, Hart's men. Ethan wrapped Ranger's leg in cloth, pressing hard to stop the bleeding. They want to scare us off. Boone spat into the dirt. Then they picked the wrong damn dog! They carried Ranger back to camp. Reggie boiled water. The woman with the guitar tore her shirt for bandages. Ethan worked in silence, his hands steady but his heart shaking. When the bleeding stopped, Ranger laid his head in Ethan's lap, breathing slow. Lucas whispered, "Will he make it?" Ethan nodded, though his voice barely held. He's too stubborn to die. Outside, thunder rumbled across the peaks. Another storm was coming, not of snow this time, but of men and greed. Days passed. Ranger began to heal, limping but alert. He stayed close to Lucas, as if still guarding him from unseen danger. The rest of the camp waited for what came next. It didn't take long. 2 weeks later, Hart returned, this time with men in construction jackets, surveying gear and cameras. "Your time's up," he said, smiling that same cold smile. "Leave peacefully, and no one gets hurt." Ethan stepped forward, his crutch sinking into the dirt. "This isn't just land, it's lives. You tear this down, you're not building a resort, you're building a graveyard." Hart's expression didn't change. "You think the mountain cares who dies on it?" Ethan stared back, calm but burning. "Maybe not, but she remembers who fought for her." Ranger growled low, the sound deep and primal. Hart's men hesitated. There was something in that dog's eyes, something they couldn't look at for long. Hart gave a short laugh. 36 hours, then we move in." When he was gone, Ethan turned to the others. "Pack if you have to, but I'm staying." Boone crossed his arms. "Then so am I." Lucas stood beside Ranger. "Me too." Ethan looked at them, this ragged, broken collection of souls who'd somehow found each other. For a moment, the weight of it all, the fear, the loss, the fight ahead, felt almost holy. "All right then," he said quietly. "Let's remind them what survival looks like." The fire crackled behind them, sparks drifting into the cold evening air. Above the ridge, storm clouds gathered once more, dark and slow. And in the center of it all, Ranger stood at the edge of camp, head high, staring into the wind, guardian of a mountain that refused to surrender. The night before the hearing, the mountain was silent. Snow fell in thin veils over Haven, dusting the rooftops, softening the scars of the storm and the fight that nearly broke them. Ethan sat by the fire, the eviction notice still folded in his pocket. The ink had begun to fade, but its threat hadn't. Across the room, Lucas huddled over Boone's old desk, surrounded by stacks of yellowed papers, faded maps, and brittle government records scavenged from the mining shack they'd found weeks earlier. His fingers were ink-stained, his eyes red from sleepless nights. "Ethan," he said finally, voice trembling but urgent. "I think I found something." Ethan turned. Lucas held up a file so old its cover had almost turned to dust. Across the top, in typewriter font, it read, "Federal Veteran Land Reclamation Project, 1947. Boone squinted. "That's older than both of us put together." Lucas flipped to the back, revealing a stamped document. "This land is hereby granted for the purpose of veteran rehabilitation and post-war resettlement." Ethan took it, reading aloud under the flicker of firelight. "Granted, in perpetuity, to those who have served." His throat tightened. "It's a veteran's refuge, always was." Boone let out a long whistle. "Then Hart's building his resort on sacred ground." Lucas looked up. "If we can prove it in court, they can't touch Haven." Ethan nodded slowly, a fire kindling behind his eyes. "Then we fight. For real this time." The next morning, the town of Ridgewell buzzed with rumors. Word had spread that the mountain hermit and his dog were going to stand against a millionaire developer. Reporters lined the courthouse steps, their breath turning to mist in the cold. When Ethan arrived, leaning on his crutch, the crowd parted. Boone followed close behind, steady as stone. Lucas carried a satchel stuffed with papers, and beside them, limping but proud, walked Ranger. The old dog's leg was still wrapped in cloth, but his head was high, his stride unbroken. The crowd went quiet. Even the camera shutters seemed to pause. Someone whispered, "That's the dog that saved the boy." Inside, the courtroom was warm but tense. Calvin Hart sat at the defense table, all confidence and polish, his lawyer flipping through binders like weapons. He smiled when Ethan entered, the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. "Mr. Walker," Hart said smoothly, "you sure you want to go through with this? You're out of your depth." Ethan met his gaze. "Funny. That's what they said about me when I built a home out of nothing." The judge entered, and the hearing began. Hart's lawyer presented first, arguing ownership, profit, and progress. "My client's company legally owns this land. The squatters, while well-intentioned, are trespassing. We sympathize, but the law is clear." Ethan's turn came. He rose slowly, gripping the table for balance. Lucas opened the satchel and handed him the document. Ethan held it up for all to see. "This isn't just paper," he said, voice steady. "This is a promise. After World War II, this land was set aside for veterans, men who came home with nothing but their names and their ghosts. It was meant to give them a place to heal." He laid the document on the judge's desk. Somewhere along the way, that promise was forgotten. But we found it, and we've lived it. Hart's lawyer objected, calling it inconclusive, but the judge motioned for silence. Boone took the stand next, testifying about the people who'd come to Haven, the families, the wounded, the lost. His words were plain, but his voice carried the weight of truth. Then Lucas spoke. The boy's voice cracked but never faltered. "I was a runaway. I thought the world didn't care if I lived or died. But Haven did. Ethan did. That dog—" He looked at Ranger, who sat by the door, eyes fixed on him. He pulled me out of the snow. You can't evict a miracle." A hush fell. Even the judge looked down, hiding something in his expression. Finally, Ethan approached one last time. "This mountain saved us when no one else would. You can build your resorts anywhere, but there's only one haven." For a moment, there was silence. Then the judge leaned forward. "Mr. Walker, this document you've provided, it bears a federal seal. I'll be recommending an injunction against Apex Development until this ownership is reviewed." Hart shot up. "You can't do that." "I can," the judge said sharply. "And I will." He turned to Ethan. "Pending federal review, Mountain Haven will be recognized as a veteran community cooperative. You are, for now, its lawful custodian." Boone grinned. Lucas let out a whoop. The courtroom erupted in quiet applause. Ethan turned toward Ranger. The dog tilted his head, tail thumping once against the floor. Ethan smiled, whispering, "We did it, partner." Outside, as they stepped into the winter light, the crowd was waiting. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed. But the noise faded when Ranger limped beside Ethan, head brushing against his hand. One little girl stepped forward, offering a folded American flag. "For your home," she said. Ethan knelt, took it gently, and handed it to Lucas. "Hang this over the gate," he said softly. "Let everyone know what we're fighting for." As they walked back down the courthouse steps, Boone chuckled. "Guess the mountain keeps its secrets, but sometimes it shares one or two." Ethan looked at the snow-capped ridge in the distance. She shared the right one. Behind him, Ranger barked once, strong and clear, a sound that carried across the square like a promise. And for everyone watching that day, it wasn't just a man and his dog walking home. It was proof that even in a world built on greed and paper, there were still places carved out by faith, fire, and loyalty. Places that refused to die. A year passed. The mountain changed again, though not the way developers or men in suits had imagined. The cabins had multiplied, their roofs patched with tin and care. Smoke curled from chimneys, voices rose with the morning light, and laughter rolled through the valley where silence once reigned. They called it Mountain Haven Center now, a refuge for veterans, the homeless, and anyone who'd lost their way. Donations trickled in from across the state after their story made the news. But it wasn't money that kept the place alive. It was heart. Lucas had grown taller, stronger. He wore a tool belt now, the same way Ethan used to. People called him the young manager, though he preferred caretaker. He knew every path, every face, every sound the mountain made when the wind turned. Boone still oversaw supplies, slower now, but with the same fire in his eyes. And Ethan wrote. Each morning, before dawn, he sat on the porch of the rebuilt lodge, notebook in hand, recording their journey. The storm, the fight, the miracle that became Haven. His handwriting was uneven, but his words carried the weight of truth. Ranger, older now, still made his rounds. His muzzle had turned grey, his gait slower, but he refused to rest. Each morning, as the fog lifted, he trotted along the path between the cabins, checking on everyone. The veterans saluted him. The children followed him. And when someone new arrived, broken or lost, it was Ranger who found them first, tail wagging like a welcome sign carved in fur and memory. "He still thinks he's in charge," Boone joked once. Ethan smiled. "He's not wrong." Life settled into rhythm. Meals shared by the fire. Tools passed hand to hand. Letters from soldiers thanking them for hope they didn't know still existed. Then one morning, the routine broke. Ranger didn't wake up. Ethan found him lying by the gate, paws crossed, eyes half open towards the sunrise. The air was still. The mountain was quiet. Even the birds waited. Lucas came running when he heard. He stopped at the sight, words dying in his throat. Boone stood behind him, hat in hand. No one spoke for a long time. Ethan knelt beside the dog who had once been his last reason to live. His hand trembled as he brushed the fur along Ranger's neck. "You made it, boy," he whispered. "You finally get to rest." They buried him at the top of the ridge that overlooked Haven, the spot where the snow melted first each spring. Together they built a small stone monument, simple but proud. Lucas carved the words himself, his knife steady despite the tears. Ranger faithful to the end. That evening, the whole camp gathered for the memorial. The air was cold but gentle, the sunset painting gold across the peaks. Ethan stood before them, his voice rough but clear. "He didn't save my life," he said, looking at the mound of earth before him. "He gave it back to me." The crowd was silent. Some bowed their heads, others wiped their eyes. Boone lit a lantern and placed it beside the stone. Its glow reflected off the plaque, flickering like a heartbeat that refused to fade. After the ceremony, Ethan returned to the porch. Lucas joined him, quiet for a while before asking, "Do you think he knew what he meant to us?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Dogs always know. They just never ask for proof." From that day on, they kept Ranger's collar hanging by the entrance to Haven. Visitors often paused to touch it before entering, as if it carried some kind of blessing. Maybe it did. Seasons turned again. The camp grew, but they never replaced Ranger. Some said they saw a lone shepherd wandering the ridge at dawn, watching over the cabins. Ethan never confirmed it, but every morning he left a piece of bread and a bowl of water by the gate, just in case. One night, as the wind rustled through the pines, Ethan sat by the fire, finishing his last entry in the journal. He wrote slowly, his words meant for whoever would find them after he was gone. "This mountain taught us how to live again. It took everything, then gave it all back, one bark, one heartbeat, one act of faith at a time. He didn't bark for food, he barked for the truth, and when we listened, we found it." He closed the notebook and looked towards the ridge, where the stone marker gleamed faintly in the moonlight. "Good night, partner," he whispered. The mountain held its breath, as if listening. Then, somewhere in the distance, a single echoing bark rolled through the trees, strong, sure, familiar. And Ethan smiled. Because some stories don't end. They just become part of the land that carried them. He didn't bark for food. He barked for the truth. What's your story with a loyal pet? If Ranger's story touched your heart, share it. Tell the world about your loyal friend. Subscribe to German Shepherd Stories, where every tale honors the bond that saves us all.